January 27, 1421. The Forbidden City. By sunrise, 2,800 women were dead. Not soldiers, not criminals, not traitors. Women, girls as young as 12 years old. Their bodies piled in courtyards, blood soaking through silk robes, faces frozen in terror. What was their crime? They served the wrong emperor. They knew too much. They existed. One woman survived. She wrote everything down. Her diary is the only record that this massacre ever happened. The imperial court erased it, burned the documents, rewrote history. For 600 years, no one spoke their names. Behind these walls, thousands of women vanished, taken as children, locked away for life, used, discarded, murdered. Some were strangled. Some were buried alive. Some were thrown down wells and left to drown. Most just disappeared. No graves, no records, no memory. This is their story. The one China tried to bury. In the Ming dynasty, no household was exempt. All young unmarried women were required to go through the Zhengde selection process. Only married women or those with certified disabilities could avoid it. Every 3 years, girls between 13 and 16 years old were gathered, separated from their families, inspected like livestock. The age of the candidates ranged mainly from 14 to 16. Virtues, behavior, character, appearance, and body condition were the selection criteria. Eunuchs left the palace searching for girls across China. They examined every detail: skin for infections, body odor, sleeping habits. Even the way a girl breathed at night could disqualify her. 100 girls at a time, lined up by age, stripped of their clothes, checked for imperfections. A mole in the wrong place meant rejection. Crooked teeth meant rejection. The wrong body proportions meant rejection. Those who passed moved to the next round. The final test was cruelest of all. Selected girls were forced to sleep beside the emperor's mother for an entire night. She listened for snoring, for sleep-talking, for restless movements. Any sound, any disturbance, and the girl was sent away. Those who remained silent were chosen. Chosen for what? A lifetime of captivity. During the Ming dynasty, Emperor Hongwu kept a harem of more than 10,000 women. The Kangxi Emperor holds the record for having the most imperial consorts with 79, though records suggest thousands of lower-ranking concubines and servants filled the palace. These numbers weren't symbolic. They were real women, real girls, real children torn from their homes. The hierarchy was brutal and absolute. At the top stood the empress, one woman. Then came the consorts, ranked in 8 tiers of decreasing privilege. Below them, the concubines, divided into high, middle, and low ranks. At the very bottom, the palace maids and servants. Girls who would never see the emperor. Girls who existed only to serve those who served him. During the Qing dynasty, the selection narrowed. Emperor Xuanzhi began to limit selection primarily to 8 banners families, mainly Manchurian and Mongolian, excluding most Han Chinese. But the practice remained the same. Girls from noble families presented as tributes. Girls from poor families, sold by desperate parents who couldn't feed them. Economic survival forced families to surrender their daughters. Some girls were 13 years old. Some were younger. Once selected, they entered the Forbidden City through the Shenwu Gate, the martial spirit gate, a name that promised protection. It delivered imprisonment. The gates closed behind them. They would never leave. Since the barbaric practice of foot binding was prominent at this time, the hobbled women could not run away or even walk into the emperor's bedchambers, but instead had to be carried naked to the expectant man. Their feet had been broken and bound since childhood, bones crushed and folded beneath silk wrappings. They couldn't run. They couldn't stand for long periods. They couldn't escape. They were carried, naked, to a man who didn't know their names. This was the selection. This was how it began. 13 years old, torn from their mothers, examined like animals, locked inside walls they would never cross again. Some would die within months. Some would live for decades, aging in silence, forgotten by everyone except the women trapped alongside them. The lucky ones were rejected, sent home with their families. The unlucky ones were chosen. They disappeared into the palace, into the harem, into history's blind spot. And once inside, there were only 3 ways out. Marriage to a nobleman, if the emperor granted permission after 5 years of service. Release at age 25 if they survived that long. Or death. The gates closed. The walls rose 40 feet high, 10 meters of stone and brick. A moat 52 meters wide surrounded the entire complex. For gates, for exits. All guarded, all monitored, all closed to the women inside. The Forbidden City was 180 acres, 980 buildings, 8,700 rooms. And yet the women trapped inside were allowed to occupy only one section. The inner court, the northern half. 6 eastern palaces and 6 western palaces, arranged symmetrically on either side of the emperor's quarters. 12 palaces total. Each one a compound with high walls, a front hall, a back hall, side chambers. Each one a prison disguised as luxury. All females within the Forbidden City were strictly sequestered in the imperial quarters, forbidden from venturing outside the northern section of the palace. They could not leave. They could not see the rest of the city. They could not walk through the gardens without permission. They existed in a space smaller than 2 football fields, surrounded by thousands of rooms they would never enter. The hierarchy inside was rigid. 8 tiers. At the top, 1 empress. Then came the imperial noble consort. 2 imperial consorts. For consorts, 6 imperial concubines. Below them, noble ladies. First-class attendants. Second-class attendants. And at the very bottom, palace maids and servants. Thousands of women, ranked by birth, by beauty, by favor, competing for the attention of one man. Most of them never met him. Concubines filled their days applying makeup, sewing, practicing various arts, and socializing. Many spent their entire lives in the palace without ever meeting the emperor. Entire lives, decades spent waiting, hoping, preparing themselves for a summons that never came. They woke each morning and painted their faces. They practiced calligraphy. They embroidered silk. They learned poetry and music. They talked among themselves in quiet courtyards, filling the hours with anything that might distract them from the truth. They had been forgotten. The emperor had hundreds of women, sometimes thousands. He couldn't possibly remember all their names. He couldn't visit them all. So he didn't. He chose favorites. He rotated through a small group of concubines he found desirable. The rest simply waited. Years became decades. Youth faded. Beauty disappeared. And still they waited. The jealousy was vicious. Hundreds of women locked in the same space, competing for the same prize. One night with the emperor. One chance to bear his child. One opportunity to rise in rank and secure some fragment of power. They schemed against each other. They spread rumors. They sabotaged rivals. Some formed alliances. Others preferred isolation. All of them understood that their survival depended on outmaneuvering the women around them. The architecture itself reinforced their isolation. The 6 eastern palaces consisted of the Palace of Great Benevolence, Palace of Celestial Favor, Palace of Eternal Harmony, Palace of Great Brilliance, Palace of Purity, and Palace of Lasting Happiness. The 6 western palaces mirrored them. Palace of Eternal Longevity, Palace of the Queen Consort, Palace for Gathering Elegance, Hall of the Supreme Principle, Palace of Eternal Spring, Palace of Universal Happiness. Beautiful names. Elegant architecture. Gilded cages. Every palace had its own courtyards, main halls, and side halls, with the front courtyard used for receptions and the back courtyard serving as living quarters. The palaces were connected by narrow passageways, creating a maze of corridors and walls. Easy to get lost in, hard to escape from. Women who tried to run were always captured. The layout itself was designed to confuse, to disorient, to trap. And there was no contact with the outside world. No letters home. No visits from family. No doctors from beyond the palace walls. Everything was controlled. Everything was monitored. The eunuchs watched them constantly. 2,000 eunuchs serving in the Forbidden City, most of them assigned to surveil the women. They reported every conversation, every movement, every suspicious glance. The women entered at age 13. Some were released at 25, if they survived and if the emperor permitted it. Most didn't leave until they died. They grew old inside those walls. Their hair turned white. Their bodies weakened. Their minds deteriorated from the monotony, the isolation, the endless waiting. Some went mad. Some killed themselves. Some simply faded away, dying quietly in rooms no one bothered to visit. There was a term for the palaces where disgraced concubines were sent. Cold palaces, not because they lacked heat, because they lacked life. Women who angered the emperor, who fell out of favor, who committed minor offenses were exiled to these sections of the inner court, left there to rot, forgotten completely. No servants, no food deliveries, no acknowledgement of their existence. They lived in filth. They starved slowly. They died alone. And the other women knew. They watched their sisters disappear into the cold palaces and understood. This could happen to any of them, at any moment, for any reason. One wrong word, one perceived slight, one political maneuver they didn't see coming. The emperor didn't need to execute them. He just needed to forget them. And in a palace of thousands of women, forgetting was easy. They had no voice, no agency, no control over their own bodies or futures. They existed at the pleasure of a man who barely knew they were alive. And when they died, no one recorded their names. No one wrote down their stories. No one remembered they had ever existed. The official histories mention the emperor, the battles, the political reforms, the grand architecture, but the women, the thousands of girls who vanished into those walls, their footnotes, anonymous, erased, until now. January 1421. The Forbidden City had just been completed. 13 years of construction, 200,000 workers, 1 million laborers total, the largest palace complex ever built. Emperor Yongle planned a grand celebration to unveil his masterpiece to the world. New Year's Day, a banquet, foreign dignitaries, the entire court assembled. And then the rumor started. One of the emperor's favorite concubines had killed herself. Suicide. Palace eunuch found her body. The whispers spread through the halls like fire. She had been having an affair with a eunuch, because the emperor couldn't perform, because Yongle was impotent. The humiliation was immediate, public, inescapable. The most powerful man in China, reduced to a joke. His masculinity questioned. His authority undermined. On the very day he was supposed to celebrate his greatest achievement, Yongle acted fast. He told the palace the concubine had been poisoned. An accident. A tragedy. Nothing more. But he knew the truth. Everyone knew the truth. And everyone who knew had to be silenced. He rounded up 2,800 women from his harem and had them all executed by slicing. Not the guilty. Not the conspirators. Everyone. Every woman who might have heard. Every servant who might have whispered. Every concubine who might have known. 2,800 women. Rounded up in a single day. The method was Ling Chi. Death by 1,000 cuts. Also called slow slicing. The executioners would make small incisions across the victim's body. Arms, legs, chest, face. Hundreds of cuts. The goal was to keep the person alive as long as possible. To maximize the pain. To make an example. In this mass execution, girls as young as 12 years old were put to death. 12 years old. Children. Girls who had barely entered the palace. Girls who couldn't possibly have known anything about an affair between a concubine and a eunuch. It didn't matter. They had been in the wrong place. They had existed in the same space as the rumor. That was enough. The executions took place in the courtyards. One by one. 2,800 times. The emperor watched. He wanted to see. Wanted to confirm that every threat had been eliminated. Wanted to ensure that no one would dare question his manhood again. There is no mention of this massacre in the official records. The imperial historians erased it, burned the documents, rewrote the story of 1421 to exclude the single largest mass murder in the Forbidden City's history. But one woman survived, Lady Cui, another of Yongle's concubines. She had been away from the palace when it happened, visiting family, or perhaps on some errand outside the walls. When she returned, 2,800 women were dead. A written account exists from Lady Cui, who had been away from the palace at the time. She wrote everything down. The details, the numbers, the horror. Her diary is the only reason we know this happened at all. Lady Cui survived the massacre, but not for long. 3 years later, in 1424, Emperor Yongle died. Lady Cui and 15 remaining concubines were hung in the Forbidden City's halls on the day of Yongle's funeral. White silk nooses, an honored death they called it, the privilege of joining the emperor in the afterlife. 30 women total were executed at his funeral, some by hanging, some by having their throats cut. She belonged to the 30 people executed in order to join the emperor by being buried with him. This wasn't new. Yongle had started a tradition, a custom borrowed from the Mongolian Yuan dynasty before him. When an emperor died, his concubines would die with him. Forced suicide, or outright murder. The logic was simple. These women belonged to the emperor. They could never take another man. So when he died, they had to follow. In line with customs at the time, the deceased emperor's concubines were either killed or made to commit suicide and buried with him. Some were outright buried alive near the mausoleum. The practice would continue for decades. Emperor Hongxi, Yongle's successor, followed the same tradition. 10 more concubines executed at his funeral in 1425. It wouldn't end until 1464, 43 years after the massacre. The Zhengde emperor finally abolished the practice in his will. But by then, hundreds of women had already been killed, strangled with silk, throats slit, buried alive in tombs alongside dead emperors, all to maintain the fiction that these women belonged to one man, even in death. The 1421 massacre alone killed 2,800. Add the earlier purges under Yongle, when he first took power and executed anyone loyal to the previous emperor. Add the concubines killed at his funeral. Add the servants, the maids, the young girls caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nearly 3,000 court ladies died under Ming Chengzu Zhu Di's butcher knife. Nearly 3,000 women, most of them teenagers, most of them nameless, most of them erased from history. And Yongle? History remembers him as a great emperor. The man who built the Forbidden City. The man who sent Zhenghe's fleet to explore the Indian Ocean. The man who commissioned the Yongle Encyclopedia, one of the largest collections of knowledge ever assembled. His name means perpetual happiness. The women he murdered don't have names. They don't have monuments. They don't have glory. They have one diary, one witness. One woman who wrote down what she saw before she was hung from a silk noose in a palace that would stand for 500 more years. 2,800 women, dead in a single day, because one rumor threatened one man's ego. But the killing didn't stop with execution. For some women, death came slowly, buried alive, trapped underground in tombs with emperors they had served, left to suffocate in the dark. The practice started with the Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty. To maintain control even beyond his death, he initiated a tradition of killing or burying concubines alongside him. The logic was straightforward. These women belonged to him. They existed to serve him. When he died, they would follow. Service him in the netherworld for all eternity. When Hongwu died in 1398, 40 concubines were forced to commit suicide to follow their emperor into the netherworld. 2 of them were buried with him and the empress in Shaoling. 40 women, killed on the same day, some by hanging with white silk nooses, some by having their throats cut, some buried alive, standing upright in pits near the mausoleum, positioned to greet the emperor when he arrived in the afterlife. Immolation was a gruesome custom that Emperor Yongle copied from the previous Mongolian Yuan dynasty. When Yongle died in 1424, the killing continued. 16 concubines were required to commit suicide and were buried alive in the eastern and western wells on either side of Chongling tomb. They were called pits because they were vertical shafts without horizontal tunnels. Dropped into holes. Left standing. The earth filled in around them. Buried alive. 16 women. Girls, some of them. Trapped in vertical shafts. Unable to move. Unable to escape. The dirt rising around their bodies. Covering their legs. Their waists. Their chests. Their faces. Suffocating slowly. Alone in the dark. One of them was Consort Han. A Korean woman. Joseon sent a total of 114 women as tribute to the Ming dynasty, and Lady Han was chosen as an imperial concubine because of her outstanding beauty. She survived the 1421 massacre. She was implicated in the alleged plot but managed to avoid being executed and was imprisoned instead. 3 years later, when Yongle died, she belonged to the 30 people executed in order to join the emperor by being buried with him. She had spent 3 years locked in a cell, knowing her execution was coming, knowing that when the emperor died, she would die too. And when that day arrived, she was dragged to the tomb, forced into a vertical shaft, buried standing, left to suffocate. The tradition continued. In 1425, 10 concubines were buried along with the 4th Ming Emperor Hongxi and Empress Zhang. Among them were noble consort Gongsu and several other named consorts. Women with titles. Women with rank. It didn't matter. They died anyway. Every concubine in the Forbidden City knew this. They understood that if their emperor died, they might be chosen to follow him. The terror was constant. The emperor's health became the most important variable in their lives. If he coughed, they panicked. If he grew weak, they prepared to die. They lived under a death sentence that could be activated at any moment. And there was no way out, no appeal, no escape. The eunuchs would come. They would select the women. Some were given silk nooses and forced to hang themselves in the palace halls. Some had their throats slit. Some were taken to the tomb site and buried alive. The practice didn't end until 1464. Emperor Yingzong, just before he died, gave his last order, abolishing the practice of burying imperial concubines and palace maids. 43 years after the 1421 massacre. 43 years after Yongle killed 2,800 women. 43 years of terror. But the damage had been done. Historical records show that around 100 imperial concubines were killed for 5 early Ming emperors. 100 women. Killed because their emperors died. Killed because tradition demanded it. Killed because they had no value beyond serving a man who no longer existed. And the women who lived through those decades, the ones who survived, they spent every day knowing they could be next, watching other women dragged away, hearing the screams, seeing the bodies, living with the knowledge that their lives were completely expendable. The Korean tribute women were particularly vulnerable. Joseon sent 114 women as gifts to the Ming court. 16 virgin girls in one shipment alone. They were foreign, isolated. They couldn't speak the language fluently. They had no family connections, no political protection. When the emperor died, they were among the first chosen for burial. Consort Han's younger sister, Han Gairan, also became a consort to the next emperor, Zhengde. She watched her sister die. She knew what fate awaited her if her emperor died first. The psychological trauma of knowing your survival depends entirely on one man's lifespan is incomprehensible. Generations of women lived in fear. From 1398 to 1464, 66 years, every concubine in the Ming court understood that an emperor's death could mean her own. They couldn't control it, couldn't prevent it, couldn't predict it. They could only wait. And when the practice was finally abolished, it wasn't because of compassion. It wasn't because the emperors suddenly valued women's lives. It was ended by an incompetent emperor known for being imprisoned by Mongols and killing an upright official. An unfit ruler who redeemed himself with one final order. Stop burying women alive. By then, hundreds were already dead, buried in vertical shafts, strangled with silk, throats cut, all to serve emperors in an afterlife that may not even exist. The tombs are still there. Chongling, the largest tomb of the Ming dynasty, built for Emperor Yongle. 16 women buried in wells on either side. Their names are lost. Their bones remain underground. Tourists walk past their burial sites without knowing they're there. But the concubines weren't the only women trapped inside the Forbidden City. Below them, forgotten and disposable, were the palace maids. The lowest tier. The most vulnerable. The ones no one remembers. Palace maids were usually victims of abuse, especially from imperial concubines. They could lose their ranks, receive severe body punishment, and be put to death even for a little error. Severe punishment and even execution was the norm for the most minor of offenses. A broken porcelain basin, stepping on a kitten, stealing silk. Any mistake could mean death. One concubine, Lady Ling, disciplined 4 maids severely between 1839 and 1840. She slapped one maid after the girl accidentally stepped on and killed a kitten, then later struck her with bamboo for breaking a porcelain basin. She administered 40 harsh blows to another maid caught stealing silk. Lady Ling was eventually demoted to the lowest rank for her frequent personal punishment of maids, but only after years of abuse, after countless beatings, after the damage had already been done. In 1778, another concubine, Lady Wang, was demoted after a palace maid succumbed to injuries from the severe beatings she had ordered. Succumbed to injuries. That's the polite way of saying she beat a young girl to death. The maid was probably 14 years old, 15 at most. Beaten until her body gave out. And Lady Wang's punishment? A demotion. Not execution. Not imprisonment. Just a lower rank. A yellow bag with bamboo sticks was kept in the Forbidden City, and Empress Dowager Cixi once ordered the palace servant girls and court ladies to beat the eunuchs with them. This was standard practice. Young girls, themselves victims of abuse, forced to inflict violence on others. The cycle continued. The trauma multiplied. Emperor Tongji's story is particularly revealing. His mother, Empress Dowager Cixi, ordered the couple to separate from his beloved wife, and Tongji purportedly spent several months following Cixi's order in isolation at Shenqing Palace. The young emperor, who could no longer cope with his grief and loneliness, grew more and more ill-tempered. He began to treat his servants with cruelty and punish them physically for minor offenses. A 19-year-old emperor, isolated by his controlling mother, taking his rage out on teenage girls who had no power to defend themselves, beating them for minor offenses, flogging them because he was angry, because he could, because they were disposable. Training for palace maids was brutal. Ants could beat, punish, or even relegate unsatisfactory trainees to menial labor. One former maid recalled decades later that they often begged their trainers to just beat them instead of assigning other punishments, explaining that while beatings were painful but brief, punishments like indefinite kneeling in corners were far worse. Days began before dawn and ended late at night, with constant pressure to perfect every detail of court etiquette and service. Emperor Puyi, the last emperor, recalled in his memoirs growing up in the Forbidden City. By the age of 11, flogging eunuchs was part of his daily routine. His cruelty and love of power were already too firmly set for persuasion to have any effect. Whenever he was in a bad temper, the eunuchs would be in for trouble. If an 11-year-old emperor was flogging eunuchs daily, what do you think was happening to the palace maids? But the physical abuse wasn't the only threat. Sexual relations and marriage between eunuchs and palace maids were referred to as duishi or tsaihu. Despite castration, if the procedure occurred after puberty, which was the case most often, eunuchs could still achieve erections. Eunuchs still had sexual desires, although they couldn't experience biological orgasms. Therefore, their relationships with palace maids often included caressing and other forms of physical intimacy. And because their sexual desire couldn't be fully satisfied, eunuchs could be abusive in their relationships. Young girls aged 14 to 16 were particularly vulnerable, isolated, powerless, supervised by men who had been castrated but still retained sexual function. Men who had suffered their own trauma and often inflicted it on others. The palace maids had no protection, no recourse, no escape. Most of these girls died anonymously. No names, no records, no acknowledgement that they had ever existed. Archaeological evidence suggests mass graves near the Forbidden City. Bones, hundreds of them. Thousands, possibly. Women and girls buried without ceremony, without markers, without memory. The psychological trauma was relentless. Palace maids witnessed massacres. They watched 2,800 women executed in a single day under Emperor Yongle. They saw concubines dragged away to be buried alive. They heard the screams. They cleaned up the blood. They lived under constant threat, knowing that any moment, they could be next. They entered the palace at 13 years old. They served for 10 years if they survived. Most didn't make it to 25. Some were beaten to death. Some starved. Some died from infections or disease because no doctors were allowed inside the inner court. Some killed themselves. The ones who survived emerged broken, traumatized, aged beyond their years. The palace system deliberately isolated them. They had no contact with the outside world. No letters, no visitors, no communication with family members. They were cut off completely, trapped inside walls that stretched 40 feet high, surrounded by a moat 52 meters wide. Even if they escaped the buildings, they couldn't escape the compound. And even if they somehow made it past the guards and the gates and the moat, where would they go? Their families had already sold them. They had nowhere to return to. The maids who survived their decade of service were allowed to leave at 25 years old. If they were lucky, they received small pensions. Most received nothing. They walked out of the Forbidden City with no money, no skills that transferred to life outside the palace, no family connections, and trauma that would follow them until death. Many ended up as beggars. Some became prostitutes. Some simply disappeared. And the ones who died inside, no one counted them. No one recorded their names. No one acknowledged that they had lived and suffered and died serving emperors who never knew they existed. Thousands of young girls died behind these walls. Their names were erased. Their suffering was hidden. But you can help bring their story to light. If this makes you angry, if you want more people to know what happened, subscribe to Throne of Lies. Every subscription is a voice for the voiceless. 1521. A new emperor ascended the throne. Zhu. He took the name Jiajing. Admirable tranquility. For the first few years, he seemed serious, ambitious. He dealt with court politics. He handled administrative duties. He appeared normal. Then the obsession began. Jiajing became fixated on one goal, immortality. He wanted to live forever. He consulted Taoist priests. He studied alchemy. He experimented with concoctions, potions, elixirs. And one priest told him the secret ingredient. The key to eternal life. Virgin menstrual blood. Girls aged 13 to 14 were kept for the production of this substance, and were fed only mulberry leaves and rainwater, as the emperor believed this would keep the blood pure. The alchemical concoction was called red lead. To make it, Jiajing needed a constant supply of virgins. Young girls. Hundreds of them. In 1547, 300 girls between the ages of 11 and 14 were selected as new palace women. They were rounded up from across China, torn from their families, brought to the Forbidden City, not to serve as concubines, not to become maids, to be harvested. The girls were restricted to a brutal diet. Mulberry leaves, rainwater, nothing else. The emperor believed this would keep their bodies pure, their blood untainted, their menstrual flow suitable for his elixir. They woke before dawn and collected dew from banana tree leaves in the palace gardens, bringing it to the emperor to drink as another method for prolonging his life. The young women were beaten and starved, and if they became ill, they were tossed away. Many fell sick from cold and malnutrition. When they did, they were punished, beaten for becoming ill, beaten for being weak. If they couldn't recover, they were thrown out of the palace, discarded like garbage. The ones who survived the starvation were used, their menstrual blood collected, processed into the red lead elixir. Fed to an emperor who believed drinking the blood of children would make him immortal. Known for his strictness and violent outbursts, Jiajing reportedly had as many as 200 palace women beaten to death during his reign. 200 women, beaten to death, not executed, not killed quickly, beaten until their bodies gave out, until they stopped breathing. His concubines weren't spared either. He beat them into submission, violently dominated them, forced them to cater to his every whim. The palace became a place of constant fear, pain, suffering, and everyone inside knew there was no escape. By 1542, 21 years into his reign, the women had endured enough. Concubine Ning hatched a plan. She was being punished, forced to collect morning dew in the gardens after the emperor's pet turtle died, and he blamed the concubines. While collecting dew, she met other women who had been similarly punished. They talked, they whispered, they conspired. If the emperor were found dead in Consort Duan's chambers, concubine Ning would be vindicated. The incident with the turtle would be forgotten. And most importantly, the torture would end. 17 women joined the plot. 10 would personally strangle the emperor. The rest would conspire and assist. They chose their moment carefully. October 1542. The emperor was alone in Consort Duan's chambers. Vulnerable. The women entered. They attacked. They used their hair ribbons first, attempting to strangle him. When that failed, they grabbed a silk curtain cord. They wrapped it around his neck. They pulled. But they tied the wrong kind of knot. The cord wouldn't tighten. It stuck. The emperor thrashed. Fought back. He fainted but didn't die. One of the conspirators, Zhang Jinlian, lost her nerve. She ran to Empress Fong and confessed everything. The empress acted immediately. She saved the emperor's life. And while he lay unconscious, unable to speak, she ordered the punishment. All 16 girls, plus Consort Duan, were executed by slow slicing. Death by 1,000 cuts. They were tied up in public, and knives were used to methodically remove portions of their body until they were dead, with some records showing this might be around 3,000 incisions over 3 days. The executioners carved their bodies piece by piece. Arms, legs, torso, face, keeping them alive as long as possible. Maximizing the pain. 10 members of the women's families were also beheaded, while a further 20 were enslaved and gifted to ministers. Their properties were seized. Their relatives punished for crimes they didn't commit. And Consort Duan? She hadn't been involved at all. She wasn't even present during the attack. But the assassination attempt took place in her chambers. Empress Fong used that as justification. She eliminated a rival. The Jiajing emperor later determined Consort Duan had been innocent and suspected the empress of using the situation to rid herself of a hated rival. But by then, Consort Duan was already dead. The emperor recovered after several days. And his response? He didn't stop making red lead. He didn't stop harvesting virgin blood. Instead, he ordered restrictions on girls entering the palace to be tightened. More security, more surveillance, more control. In 1552, a further 200 girls were selected to serve in the palace, but the minimum age limit was reduced to 8 years old. 8 years old. Children. Little girls who hadn't even reached puberty yet. 3 years later, in 1555, 150 girls below the age of 8 were taken into the palace to be used for making the emperor's medicine. Below the age of 8, toddlers, kindergarten-aged children, stolen from their families, fed mulberry leaves and rainwater, starved, beaten, harvested. The emperor withdrew to the western part of the Forbidden City after the assassination attempt. He stopped holding court. For the next 2 decades of his reign, he lived in isolation, drinking his elixirs, consuming his red lead, ingesting mercury and other toxic substances that he believed would grant him immortality. In 1567, after 45 years on the throne, the Jiajing emperor died. He was 59 years old. It has been widely speculated that he succumbed to the toxic mercury contained in the elixirs of immortality that he had been ingesting over his lifetime. The elixir didn't work. The menstrual blood of hundreds of starved children didn't grant him eternal life. Poisoned him, killed him, ended his reign. But the damage was done. Hundreds of girls had been kidnapped, starved, beaten, harvested, discarded. 200 palace women beaten to death. 17 executed by slow slicing for daring to fight back. Families destroyed, lives erased, and history remembers him as Emperor Jiajing. Admirable tranquility. His name is written in official records. His accomplishments listed. His cruelty footnoted. The girls he tortured don't have names. They don't have records. They have starvation. They have mulberry leaves. They have blood drained from their bodies to feed a madman's delusion. 1835. A girl named Yehanara was born to a mid-ranking Manchu family. 17 years later, she entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Xianfeng. She could read. She could write Chinese calligraphy. She was clever. She was beautiful. And she understood something fundamental about the palace. Power was everything, and she was going to take it. In 1856, she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son. Her rank increased. Her influence grew. When Emperor Xianfeng died in 1861, their 6-year-old son became Emperor Tongzhi. Yehanara, now called Cixi, meaning kindly and joyous, became regent alongside Empress Xiayan. But Cixi didn't share power. She seized it. She launched a coup 3 months after her husband's death. 8 regents imprisoned or executed. Complete control secured. For the next 47 years, until her death in 1908, Cixi would rule China. Not as empress, not as emperor, but as the most powerful woman in Chinese history. And she would do anything to keep that power. Anything. Cixi spied on everyone. She used palace eunuchs as her surveillance network. 2,000 eunuchs monitoring conversations, reporting movements, identifying threats. When her son, Emperor Tongzhi, came of age and married, she felt her control slipping. So she suggested the emperor and empress spend more time on studies and spied on Tongzhi using palace eunuchs. When they ignored her warnings, she ordered the couple to separate. Tongzhi spent several months following Cixi's order in isolation at Qianqing Palace. The young emperor, who could no longer cope with his grief and loneliness, grew more and more ill-tempered. He began to treat his servants with cruelty and punish them physically for minor offenses. In 1875, at age 19, he died. Some said smallpox. Others whispered syphilis. His mother showed no grief. Cixi needed another puppet. She chose her nephew, Zhaiyin. 4 years old, she adopted him as her son, taking the name Guangxu, meaning glorious succession. She would serve as his regent until adulthood. And even after he came of age in 1889, she never truly relinquished control. Emperor Guangxu married his cousin, Empress Longyu, Cixi's niece. The marriage was loveless, childless. Guangxu spent his time with someone else. Consort Zhenfei, the Pearl Consort. Zhenfei entered the palace in 1889 at age 13 and quickly became the Guangxu emperor's favorite consort, gaining significant influence. She was intelligent, curious, bold. She encouraged the emperor to pursue reforms, to modernize China, to challenge the old ways. She learned photography and invited foreigners into the Forbidden City to teach her. She dressed in men's clothes. She pushed boundaries. Cixi despised her. Zhenfei also antagonized Empress Dowager Cixi when it was discovered that she had abused her influence over the Guangxu emperor by interfering in regular procedures for civil appointments. The scandals became public in November 1894, during the First Sino-Japanese War, embarrassing the imperial court. On November 26, 1894, Cixi ordered consort Zhenfei and her sister consort Jean to be demoted. According to some reports, she even had Zhenfei flogged. She executed a palace eunuch who had collaborated with Zhenfei. A cousin of the two consorts, Zhirui, was banished from Beijing. But that wasn't enough. In 1898, Emperor Guangxu attempted to implement sweeping reforms. The 100 Days Reform, constitutional monarchy. modern education, legal reform, an end to corruption. For 100 days China changed. Then Cixi acted. She engineered a coup, reversed all reforms, placed Emperor Guangxu under house arrest. He would remain a prisoner for the rest of his life. Consort Zhengde was locked up with him. House arrest, isolated, watched constantly. For 2 years, she sat in a cell, knowing her emperor was nearby but unable to reach him. Then came 1900, the Boxer Rebellion. 8 foreign nations invaded Beijing. The imperial court prepared to flee. On June 20, 1900, as the 8-nation alliance laid siege to Beijing, Cixi forced the emperor to evacuate. She brought Empress Dowager. She did not bring consort Zhengde. According to one account from the Zhenshan diary, Empress Dowager Cixi ordered consort Zhengde to be released from house arrest and brought before her. The Empress Dowager allegedly said, "I originally planned to bring you along with us, but you are young and pretty, and are likely to be raped by the foreign soldiers on the way. I trust you know what you should do." Cixi was telling her to commit suicide. Zhengde refused. She begged the Empress Dowager to allow the Guangxu Emperor to stay in Beijing and negotiate with the foreign powers, to protect the people, to save the city. Cixi was infuriated. She ordered eunuchs to seize Zhengde and throw her down a well behind Ningxia Palace in the northeastern part of the Forbidden City. Emperor Guangxu was there, watching, held back by guards, unable to move, unable to speak. He watched the woman he loved dragged to a well, watched her thrown inside, watched her drown. Zhengde was 24 years old. Some sources say 25. Her body stayed in that well for 2 years. In January 1902, after the imperial court returned to Beijing, Cixi ordered the body retrieved. It was covered in moss, unrecognizable, decomposed beyond identification, but she had it salvaged anyway. Guilt, perhaps, or just cleanup. Emperor Guangxu never recovered. He remained under house arrest, isolated, broken. He drew pictures of turtles and wrote the name of the man who betrayed him on their backs. Yuan Shikai. Then he threw darts at them. It was the only revenge he could take. In November 1908, Cixi fell seriously ill. She knew she was dying, and she knew that if Emperor Guangxu outlived her, he would reverse everything she had built. He would restart the reforms. He would undo her legacy. So she killed him. On November 14, 1908, Emperor Guangxu died. Officially, sudden illness. Unofficially, anecdotal evidence suggests that the poison could have been placed in a simple bowl of yogurt. The Minister of Rituals in the Qing court, Pu Liang, passed this account down orally to his great-grandson, who later reported what he'd heard. A eunuch was seen coming out of the Empress Dowager's room carrying a bowl. When asked what it was, the eunuch replied, "Yogurt. The Empress Dowager asked me to give it to the emperor." 2 hours later, the emperor was dead. 22 hours later, Cixi died. Age 74. For 100 years, the truth remained speculation, rumor, suspicion. Then, in 2008, scientists examined the emperor's remains. They took a hair measuring 10 inches, and after analysis, they found its arsenic content was 2,400 times higher than normal. The research was carried out over 5 years by the National Committee for the Compilation of Qing History, the China Institute of Atomic Energy, the Forensic Lab of the Beijing Police, and China Central Television. They found that Guangxu's hair had arsenic levels 261 times higher than that of his wife, Empress Dowager, who had been buried in the same tomb, and 132 times higher than that of a Qing official. Environmental factors were ruled out. They tested his clothes. The fabric covering his stomach had extremely high arsenic levels. The total amount of arsenic found on Emperor Guangxu's clothes and hair was over 200 milligrams. An ordinary person will die from eating 60 to 200 milligrams of arsenic. Their final conclusion: Emperor Guangxu had died of acute arsenic poisoning. The evidence pointed to one person. Empress Dowager Cixi had the motive. She feared if Guangxu outlived her, he would restart his reforms and undo her work. She had the access. She controlled the palace. She commanded the eunuchs. Only one person could have made the decision to kill. Cixi poisoned her own nephew, the emperor she had chosen, the boy she had raised, the man she had imprisoned for 10 years. She murdered him rather than risk losing control. 2 deaths, 2 victims of the same woman. Consort Zhengde drowned in a well at 24. Emperor Guangxu, poisoned with arsenic at 37. Both loved each other. Both tried to reform China. Both threatened Cixi's power. Both were eliminated. History remembers Cixi as a powerful ruler. A modernizer, some say. A woman who opened China to the West. A shrewd politician who held the empire together through turbulent times. She ruled for 47 years. Longer than most emperors. Stronger than most men. But she murdered an emperor. She drowned a 24-year-old woman in a well. She controlled China through fear, surveillance, and violence. And when her power was threatened, she killed without hesitation. The well is still there, behind Ningxia Palace. Tourists can visit it. Consort Zhengde's well. A memorial to a woman thrown inside and left to drown because she dared to speak up. Because she encouraged reform. Because she loved the wrong man. Emperor Guangxu's tomb stands in the Western Qing imperial tombs. His body lies next to Empress Longyu, the woman he never loved. Not next to Zhengde, the woman he watched die. Separated in life. Separated in death. Cixi is buried in the Eastern Qing imperial tombs. Her tomb was looted in 1928 by warlord Sun Jiajing. Her body was thrown out. Her treasures stolen. The woman who ruled China for half a century, discarded like trash. But Zhengde and Guangxu? They're remembered, not for their power, not for their accomplishments, for how they died, for what they tried to do, for the reforms that never happened, for the love that was destroyed, for the cruelty of a woman who refused to let go. 1505. Emperor Hongzhi died. His son ascended the throne. Zhu Hozhao, age 14. He took the name Zhengde, rectification of virtue. His father had been different. The only monogamous emperor in Ming history. One wife, no concubines. Confucian values, hard work, reform. He had loved his son deeply, tried to raise him properly, educated him in everything a good emperor should know. On his deathbed, he summoned his officials and begged them to watch over the boy, to guide him, to keep him from making mistakes. Zhengde ignored all of it. Within months, he dismissed his teachers. He expelled his father's advisors. He abandoned court rituals. He stopped attending government meetings. He handed control of the empire to eunuchs, particularly Lu Jin, who embezzled 36 million pounds of gold and silver before being executed for plotting to murder Zhengde and replace him with his own grandnephew. Zhengde had other interests. Wine, hunting, women. He built a palace called the Leopard's Chamber outside the Forbidden City, initially to house exotic animals, tigers, leopards, creatures he could hunt for sport. Later, he used it to house beautiful women for his personal enjoyment. On one occasion he was badly mauled while hunting tigers and could not appear in court audiences for a month. On another occasion he burned down his palace by storing gunpowder in the courtyards during the Lantern Festival. The entire palace caught fire. It burned to the ground. He didn't care. He just moved somewhere else. He grew tired of his own harem. So he left the Forbidden City and wandered Beijing's streets in disguise, pretending to be a commoner. Everyone knew it was the emperor. His guards seized beautiful women and brought them back to the palace. Prostitutes were inspected by the emperor personally, and those he liked were kept. Even the concubines of his own military commanders were taken for Zhengde's pleasure. He frequented brothels for months at a time. He drank himself unconscious, remaining drunk for days on end. He created a staged commercial district inside his palace and ordered his ministers, eunuchs, soldiers, and servants to dress up as merchants and street vendors while he walked through pretending to be a regular citizen shopping. The game a 3-year-old might play with their grandmother. Except he was a grown man, an emperor, responsible for millions of lives. And the women kept accumulating. He collected so many concubines that his harem became overfilled. There were too many women. Not enough space to house them. Not enough food to feed them. Many starved to death due to lack of supplies. Women locked inside a palace surrounded by imperial wealth, dying of hunger. Not because there was a famine. Not because the empire was poor. Because the emperor couldn't be bothered to organize basic logistics for the human beings he had kidnapped. They died slowly, competing for scraps, fighting over limited rations, growing weaker each day, their bodies shutting down from malnutrition while the emperor drank himself into oblivion in brothels across Beijing. The paradox was grotesque. Palace filled with gold, jade, silk, porcelain, treasures beyond measure, and women starving to death inside it. Not in dungeons, not in prison cells, in the harem, in rooms meant for comfort and luxury, surrounded by abundance they couldn't access. Zhengde showed no interest in his wife, Empress Xia. The marriage was political, loveless, childless. She outlived him by 14 years, dying in 1535 with no children, no legacy, nothing except the memory of a husband who ignored her completely. For months at a time Zhengde would live outside the Forbidden City or travel around the country with heavy expenditures being paid from the empire's coffer. While being urged to return to the palace and attend to governmental matters, Zhengde would refuse to receive all his ministers and ignored all their petitions. The government collapsed around him. Corruption spread. Rebellions erupted. His own relatives, the Prince of Anhua and the Prince of Ning, led uprisings against him. The empire was falling apart. Women were starving in the palace. The treasury was being looted, and Zhengde didn't care. In October 1520, while fishing from a small boat during a return trip from Nanjing, Zhengde fell off the boat into the Yellow River. He nearly drowned. The water was contaminated. He contracted a parasite. For months he grew sicker, weaker, his body failing. On April 20th, 1521, Emperor Zhengde died, aged 29, no sons, no heirs, no legacy except chaos, corruption, and starvation. Many historians claim that it was Zhengde's rule that led to the downfall of the Ming dynasty. His successor Jiajing would be even worse, but the damage had already been done. The women who starved in his harem don't have names, don't have records, don't have graves. They died anonymously, forgotten. Victims of an emperor who cared more about pretending to be a commoner than feeding the women he had imprisoned. Zhengde's tomb is called Kongling. It sits at the foot of Mount Jinling in the Ming Imperial Cemetery. He was buried alongside Empress Xia, the wife he ignored his entire life. The tomb covers 27,000 square meters. Elaborate, expensive, built in just over a year. The women who starved to death in his palace weren't buried in tombs. They were likely thrown into mass graves, or burned, or simply left to rot. No one recorded what happened to their bodies. No one cared. History remembers Zhengde as a self-indulgent ruler, a womanizer, a drunk, poor administrator, a man who played games while his empire collapsed. His name means rectification of virtue. The irony is suffocating. For centuries, these emperors were celebrated as heroes. Their cruelty was buried. Their victims were forgotten. But now you know the truth. If you want to see more dark histories exposed, if you believe the throne of lies needs to be revealed, subscribe. Don't let these stories die in silence. The question everyone asks, why didn't they run? Why didn't they fight back more often? Why did thousands of women simply accept their fate? The answer is simple. They couldn't. Start with the physical barriers. The Forbidden City is surrounded by a 7.9-meter high wall, 26 feet of brick and stone, 8.62 meters thick at the base, tapering to 6.66 meters at the top. The walls were constructed with a rammed earth core, surfaced with 3 layers of specially baked bricks on both sides, with the interstices filled with mortar. At the 4 corners of the wall sit corner towers with intricate roofs. Guards stationed day and night, watching, waiting. Around the walls a moat, 52 meters wide, 171 feet across. 6 meters deep, 20 feet of water. The moat circles the entire palace complex, with the total length of 3,530 meters. Both sides of the moat have steep embankments, making crossing without a bridge impossible. Only 4 bridges cross it. For entrances, for exits, all guarded, all monitored, all controlled. Even the foundation was built to prevent escape. The city is built with a system of stones laid crosswise on top of each other to prevent assassins from tunneling in beneath the city. If trained assassins couldn't tunnel in, palace women certainly couldn't tunnel out. But even if a woman somehow scaled the 26-foot wall or swam across 171 feet of water with steep embankments, she faced another problem. Her feet. Since the barbaric practice of foot binding was prominent at this time, the hobbled women could not run away. Their feet had been broken since childhood. Bones crushed, arches folded, wrapped in silk bindings that never came off. They couldn't run. They could barely walk. Some had to be carried everywhere. The palace women were carried naked to the expectant emperor because they physically couldn't walk to his chambers. How do you escape when you can't even stand without pain? When every step is agony? When running is impossible? You don't. Then there's the isolation. No communication with the outside world. No letters home. No visitors. No doctors from beyond the palace walls. Everything was controlled. Everything was monitored. The women had no allies. No one to help them. No one to coordinate with. They were completely cut off from anyone who might have assisted in an escape. And where would they go? Their families had already sold them, taken payment for their daughters. 13-year-old girls handed over to imperial officials in exchange for money or favor or survival. Those families couldn't take them back. Wouldn't take them back. Some didn't want to. The economic reality was brutal. These girls came from poor families. Families that couldn't afford to feed them. Selling a daughter to the palace meant one less mouth to feed. One less dowry to save for. If a girl somehow escaped and made it home, she would be a burden. An embarrassment. A failure. Many families would have turned them away. But the physical barriers weren't even the worst part. The surveillance was relentless. 2,000 eunuchs serving in the Forbidden City, most of them assigned to monitor the women. They reported every conversation, every movement, every suspicious glance. A yellow bag with bamboo sticks was kept in the Forbidden City for beatings. The eunuchs used it constantly. The women couldn't trust anyone. Not the other concubines who were competing for the same privileges. Not the maids who might report them for favor. Not even each other. The system deliberately turned them against one another. Small privileges. Tiny improvements in rank. Better food. Nicer rooms. These carrots kept the women competing instead of uniting. The hierarchy manipulation was genius. Give a palace maid slightly better food if she reports on her friends. Promote a low-ranking concubine if she betrays a rival. Create a system where survival depends on cooperation with oppression. Where the only way up is by pushing others down. And the fear was constant. These women had witnessed massacres. They watched 2,800 women executed in a single day. They saw concubines dragged away to be buried alive. They heard the screams. They cleaned up the blood. They knew what happened to women who resisted. The psychological trap was complete. Some women internalized their captivity. They convinced themselves it was an honor. That being chosen for the palace was a privilege. That serving the emperor was their purpose. The human mind can't survive in constant terror, so it adapts. It reframes. It finds meaning in suffering because the alternative is madness. They called it the Forbidden City, as if it were sacred, as if being forbidden to leave was a sign of importance rather than imprisonment. The language itself was designed to obscure the truth. Concubines, palace women, ladies in waiting, beautiful words for kidnapped girls. It was presented as honor when it was captivity, privilege when it was slavery, service when it was exploitation. The entire system was built on lies. Pretty lies, elegant lies, lies wrapped in silk and gold and imperial yellow tiles. The gilded cage wasn't a metaphor. It was literal. Gold everywhere. Jade, treasure, luxury. And none of it mattered because they couldn't leave. Because their feet were broken. Because the walls were 26 feet high. Because the moat was 171 feet wide. Because 2,000 eunuchs were watching. Because their families wouldn't take them back. Because they had nowhere to go. They were trapped from the moment they entered. Age 13. Selected. Examined. Chosen. Locked inside walls they would never cross again unless they were carried out dead. And the ones who tried to escape, the rare few who attempted it, they were always captured. The layout of the Forbidden City was designed to confuse, to disorient, to trap. Narrow passageways, maze-like corridors, high walls between sections. Even if you somehow got past the guards and the eunuchs and the other women who might report you, you couldn't find your way out. And if you did, if you somehow made it to a gate, the punishment was immediate, public, brutal, execution by slow slicing, or beating to death, or being thrown down a well. The emperor would make an example. Remind the other women what happened to those who tried to leave. So they didn't try, they stayed, they survived, they adapted, they competed for scraps of privilege. They filled their days with makeup and sewing and arts and socializing. They waited, they hoped, they prayed for the emperor to die, because his death might mean their release. Most died waiting, inside those walls, behind that moat, trapped in the largest palace complex in the world. Surrounded by 980 buildings, 8,700 rooms, and not one exit they could reach. How many died? No one knows the exact number. The imperial records don't say. The official histories don't count them. But we can estimate. Emperor Yongle alone killed nearly 3,000 palace women. 2,800 in the 1421 massacre. 16 buried alive at his funeral. Dozens more executed throughout his reign. That's one emperor. One reign. 22 years. Add Emperor Jiajing. 200 palace women beaten to death during his 45-year rule. Hundreds more starved while being harvested for menstrual blood. 17 executed by slow slicing for fighting back. Add Emperor Zhengde. Dozens starved to death because he collected too many concubines and couldn't feed them all. Add the Hongwu Emperor. 40 concubines forced to commit suicide at his funeral. Add Emperor Hongxi. 10 more concubines buried with him. Add the hundreds executed at other imperial funerals. The women thrown down wells. The palace maids beaten to death for minor offenses. The girls who died from starvation, disease, infections that went untreated. The suicides. The ones who simply disappeared. Conservatively, across the Ming and Qing dynasties, at least 10,000 women died violently inside the Forbidden City. Executed. Murdered. Beaten. Starved. Buried alive. Drowned. That's violent death. Intentional killing. Tens of thousands more died from neglect. Disease. Malnutrition. The psychological trauma of captivity. The physical consequences of foot binding. The infections from unsanitary conditions. The mental breakdowns from isolation. They entered at 13 years old. Most never made it to 25. The killing continued for centuries. 1368 to 1912. 544 years. 24 emperors. 14 of the Ming dynasty. 10 of the Qing dynasty. Generation after generation of women. Trapped and forgotten. Then it ended. 1912. The Qing dynasty fell. The last emperor, Puyi, age 6, abdicated the throne. The Forbidden City ceased to be the political center of China. The gates opened. The walls came down. The women were finally allowed to leave. After being the home of 24 emperors, the Forbidden City ceased being the political center of China in 1912 with the abdication of Puyi, the last emperor of China. Some palace women were given small pensions. Others received nothing. They walked out into a world they didn't recognize. Streets they had never seen. A republic they didn't understand. They were middle-aged women with broken feet, no marketable skills, and trauma that would never heal. Most had spent their entire lives imprisoned. Age 13 to death. Decades inside those walls. They had entered as girls. They left as strangers in their own country. In 1925, the Forbidden City became a museum. The Palace Museum. Tourists began arriving, walking through the halls, admiring the architecture, marveling at the gold and jade, taking photographs of the throne rooms and courtyards. In 1987, UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site, the largest collection of preserved ancient wooden structures in the world. Significant cultural value, historical importance, architectural magnificence. Today, it receives 14 million visitors annually, 19 million in 2019. Tourists from around the world. They walk through the 6 eastern palaces and the 6 western palaces. They stand in the courtyards where 2,800 women were executed. They pass by the well where consort Xinfei drowned. They photograph the chambers where girls were harvested for menstrual blood. Most don't know. The tour guides don't mention it. The plaques don't explain it. The museum preserves the beauty, the grandeur, the imperial glory, not the screams, not the blood, not the thousands of women who died there. Archaeological evidence suggests mass graves near the Forbidden City. Bones. Unmarked burial sites. The physical remains of women who were never properly buried, never mourned, never remembered. In imperial China, when large numbers of palace servants died, their bodies often disappeared into unmarked mass graves, their existence erased from official memory. The wells are still there, the courtyards, the palaces, the walls, everything preserved, everything maintained, everything beautiful. But beneath the gold and jade, beneath the imperial yellow tiles, beneath 5 centuries of architectural achievement, there is blood. Thousands of forgotten women, girls taken at 13, used, discarded, murdered, erased. Their names are lost. Their faces are unknown. Their stories were buried with them. But they existed. They lived. They suffered. They died. And now, the Forbidden City is a monument to imperial power, to Chinese culture, to architectural genius. But it's also a tomb. A mass grave disguised as a palace. A crime scene preserved as a tourist attraction. The women who died there have no memorials, no plaques, no acknowledgement. They're ghosts in the most visited museum in China. Invisible, silent, forgotten. Except they're not. Not anymore. Their names are lost. But their story survives. Subscribe to Throne of Lies.